It's the face of our worst nightmare, the leader of the worst ever terrorist attack on America.
This is a man who knew that he was going to his death.
But to those who knew Mohamed Atta, there was little to warn of his evil intent.
He was an absolutely normal student.
Behind the bland exterior lay a murderous rage.
People who commit these kinds of acts and have the intensity and the obsessiveness to go through with them are so driven by their own rageful passions.
Who was Mohamed Atta? To his family and friends, he was a sweet-natured, shy young man, a diligent student, a good Muslim. To the investigators of America's worst ever terrorist attack, he was the central figure in a gang of vicious hijackers who masterminded the attacks on September 11th and flew the first plane to hit the World Trade Center. Hello, I'm Bill Curtis. Tonight, in a special investigation with the New York Times, we go behind the headlines to get inside the story of Mohamed Atta. We filmed in his home city of Cairo, Egypt, in Hamburg, Germany, where he was known as a brilliant student of architecture, and in the United States, where he spent his last 18 months in a whirl of activity, culminating in that lethal journey into the Twin Towers. America and much of the rest of the world has struggled to come to terms with the enormity of what happened on September 11th. The New York Times has investigated the background of the terrorists in an attempt to understand why they were driven to wreak such havoc. Investigative editor Ethan Bronner says it soon became clear that one of the hijackers stood out from the pack.
Everything we know tells us that Mohamed Atta was the ringleader of this attack. When experts think about suicide bombers, they tend to think of desperate young men, people who have nothing to lose in the world, no professional training, no family. But Mohamed Atta does not fit that profile at all.
Boston psychiatrist Stuart Gracian has profiled Middle Eastern terrorists with similar backgrounds to that of Mohamed Atta.
It's a frightening prospect that a person can live with as much rage as Atta lived. But in fact, many people do that. Many people who are filled with that kind of rage will deliberately, slowly, with tremendous planning, act it out and act upon it.
The story begins 6,000 miles from where it ended, in the Egyptian capital of Cairo. Mohamed El-Amir Atta was born on September 1st, 1968. As a child, he seemed destined for a conventional and non-threatening life.
His father was a lawyer, and he has two sisters, one of whom became a doctor and one of whom became a professor. He lived in a nice middle-class neighborhood, and he came from a home with ambitions and education.
Atta was the baby of the family, a slender, shy boy who grew up in the shadow of his domineering father. Atta's father refused to be interviewed for this program unless the New York Times paid $25,000 to a Palestinian charity. But in this earlier interview, he insists his son was an innocent victim of a wicked conspiracy by American and Israeli intelligence.
He was religious, sensitive and pure. He wasn't an extremist. Mossad did it. They hit America to weaken the Arabs in order to swallow Palestine.
His father nicknamed Atta Little Bird and complained that Mohammed was spoiled by his mother.
Mohammed had no connection with politics at all. He's like a piece of sugar or candy.
When he was 11, Atta went to this school in the Abdin neighborhood of Cairo. The quiet, studious boy failed to mix well in the playground, but is still remembered by former classmate Mohamed Hassan.
Mohamed was very quiet, highly methodical, and serious.
منظم جدا جد.
Although Atta was brought up as a Muslim, there was little in his early education and religious upbringing to explain the fundamentalist fury that would ultimately engulf him.
كله مندهش بوقته. مش مصدق.
All the neighbors were astonished when they heard. Nobody believed it, of course. It was like a girl. He never raised his voice. It couldn't be him.
As Atta grew through his teens in the 1980s, traditional Islamic religious beliefs provided some comfort for millions of ordinary Egyptians who had gained little benefit from the billions of dollars given in aid by the United States. Ruel Guricht is a former CIA officer who has tracked the development of Islamic terrorism in Egypt.
I think Egypt is an Arab country with a great past, arguably the greatest past of any Arab country, and it's a country with very little promise. It is a society that is caught between government, police state, and Islamic extremism. The competition between the two over the last 20 years have nearly squeezed the life and the humor and certainly the economic possibilities out of the country.
Islamic fundamentalist terror rocked Egypt in the late 1980s. Assassinations and bombings led to harsh government reprisals, and thousands of angry young Egyptian men were imprisoned without trial.
If you realize that, in fact, a young man has very little promise, little hope, and chances of a meaningful job, of a meaningful family life, of having a wife, it's quite natural if, in fact, you're growing up in a society that offers so little hope and promise as has Egypt, whose government, again, aligns itself officially with the U.S. government, to grow up hating the United States.
On the surface, Mohamed Atta appears to have been unaffected by the chaos on the streets. In 1985, at the age of 17, he enrolled here at the University of Cairo to study architecture. Atta immersed himself in his studies and at first followed his father's advice to concentrate on self-improvement rather than get involved in local politics. But Atta was surrounded with hard evidence that his own future and that of his country was far from secure.
In truth, Egypt is largely poor, heavily poor, with a very, very narrow slice of extreme wealth. And Atta, building a sense of injustice as he looked around him, clearly was struck by this inequality and was horrified by it.
Atta graduated from Cairo University in 1990, but despite his qualifications, he couldn't find a job in his home country. The ambitious, frustrated young man was forced to look to the West for a way out. In the fall of 1992, the 24-year-old Atta left Cairo and traveled to the North German city of Hamburg. The move to Germany became a key step in Atta's transformation into a terrorist. Students from the Middle East were warmly welcomed at the Technical University of Hamburg by Chancellor Jörg Severin.
We started great marketing campaigns worldwide to gain foreign students and to ask them to study here. And we were successful in doing this. And among those, there was Mohamed Atta.
Atta was just one of hundreds of quiet, hard-working foreign students who appeared to lead an entirely unremarkable life.
He was an absolutely normal student. He was a foreigner, of course, but there are over 20% foreigners here, hundreds of of Arabic students here. It was absolutely normal. And that's the thing that is the most astonishing experience in all this affair.
Atta took a part-time job at the urban planning firm where he was employed to do detailed technical drawings by Jörg Lewin.
He was very conscientious in the work that he did. He was on time, he left things clean, he always thought about what he had done.
The attentive student was also a scrupulous and skillful draftsman. This is just one of the many drawings, but he had strong feelings about what he saw as the decadent and unacceptable Western face of architecture.
He came under the influence of a lot of thinking that was prevalent in the mid and late 90s about what was wrong with the world and that it was American-directed. He also was troubled by what he saw as these high skyscrapers, which seemed to him again a symbol of a sort of Western imperial version of reality.
In 1993, while Atta was still studying in Germany, the world's most famous skyline was targeted by Islamic terrorists for the first time. 6 people died, and hundreds were injured when a bomb exploded at the base of the World Trade Center. Former FBI agent Bill Gavin investigated the first attack and says the bombers shared the worldview of Mohamed Atta.
It's a hatred of everything that the United States stands for. The fact that we have an ally called Israel, that is a bone in the throat. The fact that maybe the Palestinians aren't getting what they think the Palestinians deserve, that again, they pull all these things together and say there is absolutely nothing good about the United States.
Ramzi Youssef, the leader of the first attack, was finally caught in 1996. Bill Gavin brought Youssef by helicopter to New York to stand trial.
As we got to about 34th Street, I looked straight ahead and I saw the Twin Towers standing there, and so I took the hood off Ramzi and I said to him, "Ramzi, you see what's standing out in front of you? It's the trade towers and they're still there." And his comment was, "They wouldn't be if I had had enough explosive and enough money."
And there was a chilling warning of what was to come on September 11th. At his trial, Youssef boasted that the plan had been to make the towers collapse and so kill thousands, the very result later achieved by Mohamed Atta.
The attack on the World Trade Center was obviously an attempt to finish the attempted attack by Youssef in '93, and that it was a way of ramming home the point that we may have failed once, but we will succeed the second time.
Mohamed Atta's evolution into the leader of the September 11th attack was a slow and subtle process. Between 1992 and 1999, the German city of Hamburg provided the perfect location to disguise that transformation.
There is an Islamic subset in Germany. Movement is very easy. And for Arabs to come to Germany has, at least in the past, not been difficult. So you've got the combination of free flow, a receptive environment, a tolerant society more or less, and you can easily understand why Germany could be a very attractive launch board for terrorist activities elsewhere.
Atta was becoming increasingly religious and spending most of his time with other devout Muslims. His Western work colleagues couldn't help but notice how his faith dictated every aspect of his behavior.
When we had a coffee, when we had cake where there was gelatine, he wouldn't eat it because there could be pork in the gelatine. Whenever we offered him a piece of cake, he looked at the package and read what was inside. And of course, he never took alcohol.
Like all good Muslims, Atta was expected to make a holy pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia.
When he was in Mecca, he grew a beard, as Muslims do, as one is not supposed to shave on the pilgrimage. And when he came back to Germany, he still had the beard at the beginning. He was more serious. One could not imagine Mohammed laughing or laughing out loud.
Atta made frequent trips home to Cairo, where he was confronted with evidence that the decadent ways of the West were transforming and even destroying much he held dear.
Among the things that most troubled and angered Mohamed Atta on his return to Egypt was to see that some of the beautiful old gates to the old ancient city of Cairo were not being restored in the kind of traditional fashion that he would have wanted. It seemed to him that what was great and beautiful about old Egypt was being destroyed, and in its place were coming the kind of fast food, commercialization and globalization that he thinks of as the United States imposed.
And there was another sign of how religion was now dominating Atta's thoughts. In April 1996, the 27-year-old wrote his last will and testament. Extracts testify to his growing extremism.
My understanding is that Atta had a series of disappointments in his life, a series of what amounted to failures, of not being able to be educated in his own country, of having to leave, of having to be in a community that was much more liberal, much more worldly than he was.
In 1997, Atta lost his part-time job with the German urban planning company. He returned to Egypt, but despite his qualifications, was still unable to find work.
He virtually had nowhere to go, no jobs, no promise of anything, no possibility really of a productive family life. It probably a pretty bleak future for him.
Atta was enraged by the economic inequalities at home and deeply frustrated by his own lack of prospects. It's now that investigators believe these feelings of alienation and extreme religious beliefs pushed Atta over the edge and allowed him to become an Islamic terrorist.
One of the questions we ask is what turns someone into a fundamentalist? And one of the ideas that comes to mind is that, well, if you in fact can't plug into all of this Western society, if you can't use what the West has offered you, then it seems to you like a sham.
From 1997 to October 1998, Atta disappeared from Hamburg. The university authorities say they had no idea where he had gone.
Nobody knows what he might have done. There must be a gap of 2 years or so in his curriculum, and nobody knows what he did then. And maybe that he might have changed during those 2 years.
German and U.S. intelligence now believe that in those 2 years, Atta in fact went to Afghanistan to be trained by Osama bin Laden's terror organization.
But there is one place that absolutely resonates with the human being he is, and that is an organization like the bin Laden organization, which absolutely takes the anger, takes the desperation, takes the righteousness, and brings it all together and plays a kind of music that it is absolutely, well, it's music to his ears. It's absolutely right. It fits. And it carries all the weight.
Atta returned to Hamburg in the fall of 1998. His transformation into a terrorist there has been tracked by the New York Times German bureau chief, Steve Erlanger.
You get to know these people a little bit better. And Atta, I think, was a very interesting, very complicated man.
The New York Times has been told by German intelligence that Atta was, by this point, the hub of a terror cell, operating out of this apartment on a quiet, nondescript street in Hamburg.
Here we are in Marienstrasse 54, which is where Mr. Atta and his friends and co-conspirators lived. It's a very small, kind of intimate place on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's very cold, brick and stone. And this street, you know, it looks like a very bourgeois little street. It was a perfect place, in a way, to hide.
In December 1998, Atta began sharing the apartment on Marienstrasse with a steady stream of other young Arab men. Their presence was never discovered by the German authorities. Atta and his colleagues were able to blend easily into the local environment. In the world of espionage, they're known as sleepers.
And it simply describes people who are put in place by a secret organization and told to wait and told to keep their noses clean and prepare for an event later on. In other words, they're living secretly in amongst a society.
This ability to move unnoticed in Western society made Atta a valuable asset to Islamic terrorists.
He was a very good operator, and certainly his time in Germany, he was not one of those who apparently closeted himself away completely, and that he did absorb and socially adjust enough to move in the Western world freely.
Atta was also prepared to use his religious faith as a cover for his terrorist conspiracy.
In January 1999, Some students asked the president for a room where they could pray, Muslim students. Whatever they might have done in that room was not to our knowledge. Unfortunately, we never checked, we never asked for that.
The German police now believe Atta used the prayer group meetings to communicate with other terrorists. He even installed a computer and telephone line in the room to allow him to send emails to his taskmasters in Afghanistan.
Clearly, plotting was going on, and his life here was being used as a cover.
By 1999, Mohamed Atta had completed his transformation from a quiet mama's boy into a dedicated, single-minded terrorist. For the next 15 months, he would live amongst Americans, in the belly of the beast, surrounded by everything he despised, plotting his vengeance. As we continue our investigation with reporters from the New York Times, we track Atta's movements and speak to the people still struggling to come to terms with their encounter with a terrorist. Mohamed Atta came to America as a committed Islamic extremist, determined to strike in the one place least prepared for a terrorist attack.
I find the new breed like Mohamed Atta to be terrifying. Again, it's very difficult to deal with individuals who appear in so many ways normal. Atta is so frightful because he was able to stay so long in the Western world, and his holy warrior spirit did not diminish.
Atta spent his time here in a state of near perpetual motion, driving and flying thousands of miles, visiting co-conspirators in New Jersey, Las Vegas, Maryland, and San Diego. But his own main base of operation was Florida.
Florida is a very fast-growing population with a wide range of people, many Latinos, many Arabs, many people coming from the north, a broad range of people, and many of them are transient and recently arrived. And it was a cheap place to live. It is not expensive to rent apartments and to rent cars in a place like southern Florida.
Florida also has more private flying schools than any other state. Its good weather and lack of mountains make it the perfect location for would-be pilots. Atta learned to fly at Huffman Aviation in the small town of Venice. His first teacher was Mark Mickertz.
Atta was very quiet. He didn't care to chit-chat very much. He was very much one track, hey, let's get going, very business-oriented, and I was like, okay, I respect that, fine.
Atta was to spend nearly $20,000 on 300 hours of lessons before getting his license. He told Mark he planned to work as a pilot in his home country of Egypt.
He wasn't any different than any other international student that comes in here. He was just a normal guy. I mean, he didn't have, you know, the cold, steely eyes of a killer or something. I mean, no, nothing like that.
It soon became clear that Atta did not enjoy taking directions from his American trainer.
Atta, I would say, was very, as focused as he was on the ground, he seemed very unfocused in the air, and he didn't take to orders at all.
On one occasion, Atta's refusal to take orders almost caused the training plane to crash.
Now the nose was coming way up, you know, finally we start getting indications in the cockpit, you know, we get, you know, bells and whistles going off. Basically, we're about to tumble out of the sky. So finally, you know, being fed up with it, I took my thumbs and I shoved forward on the yoke and I said, nose down, you know, kind of making us pop out of the seat a little bit. And he didn't like that. Obviously didn't want to listen to me telling him that he's doing something wrong. How dare I?
Although the arrogant, bad-tempered young Arab wasn't liked at Huffman Aviation, he never raised suspicions.
Mohamed Atta and his colleagues had a very nasty goal ahead of them. And yet, as they went through the steps of getting there, they raised very few alarms among Floridians and among Americans generally, because people are not particularly suspicious.
After the near-miss and argument in the cockpit, Atta insisted on Mark being replaced by another trainer and went on to complete his 6-month course. He was living in a succession of anonymous apartments and condos in some of the most popular tourist resorts in Florida. So how did this devout Muslim cope with living in a world so alien to everything he believed so fervently in.
American society today is, after all, saturated with sexuality on television, in movies. It is a society in which temptations of the flesh are everywhere. And Mohamed Atta is an individual who believes that that is precisely what's wrong with contemporary life. It is easy to imagine that these temptations were seen to him as just perversions of life, and that he needed to bat them away as he stayed focused on his goal.
Despite the challenges of the world he was now surrounded by, Atta never swerved from his mission.
I don't find it all that surprising that Atta could be here and carry forth his plan, not be seduced by America. The plan, the knowledge that one is moving towards a goal of vengeance becomes all-consuming and all-containing.
Atta continued his methodical planning for September 11th. He next needed to be able to control a much bigger plane, a passenger jet. So he and one of the other hijackers paid $3,000 to be trained at a flight simulator at Opa-locka Airport in Miami. His teacher was Henry George.
They were overtrained for what they did. It was a very simple maneuver that a pilot with a couple of hours could have accomplished easily.
Despite subsequent press reports, Henry George says Atta and the other hijacker did practice some takeoffs and landings. But most of their time was spent mastering the simple skill of keeping a large passenger jet on a straight course.
It didn't require any great skills. Unfortunately, technology is out there, and anybody with very little experience could have done exactly what they did.
Before working in simulators, Henry George flew passenger jets for more than 20 years. He has to live with the knowledge that he provided the final training Atta needed to fly into the World Trade Center.
It's a terrible feeling to feel that your skills, which I'm very proud of, were taken advantage of.
The New York Times has discovered that Atta was not content with acquiring the skills of a pilot. He also appears to have made determined efforts to add another terrifying weapon to his terrorist arsenal.
We have good reason to believe and to fear that he was hoping and considering the possibility of dropping biological weapons on Americans.
In the summer of 2001, Atta and some of his fellow conspirators made a number of visits to a crop dusting firm in Belle Glade, Florida, owned by J.D. Lee.
I didn't spend much time talking to them at all. They asked me how much fuel the airplane hold, and I told them. And they wanted to know how fast it went, and I told them that. And then they started asking how big a load it hauled and so forth, and I turned and walked back to the airplane, and I didn't take time to talk with them much. I did ask them, a couple of them, where they were from, and they said Saudi Arabia was the answer they gave.
The planes the inquisitive Arab men were most interested in are normally used to spray pesticide over crops at low altitude. Mechanic James Lester remembers that one of the visitors, since identified as Mohamed Atta, was particularly persistent in wanting information and access to the crop dusting planes.
He was real bold, he was insistent. He was real persistent about getting into the airplane. And I says, hey, you got to leave here. I said, we're working here. I said, I ain't got time to talk to you now. When I turned, he's standing right there, so I just took my hand and I shoved him. I said, hey, you got to leave.
What now seems odd, even sinister behavior, rang no alarm bells at the time. No one thought to call the authorities about the fact that as many as 15 Arab men were making repeated attempts to get information about crop dusting.
We were not yet in a state of mind as a nation and a society that said to ourselves, well, if young Arab men are asking about crop dusting equipment, perhaps they're planning to drop anthrax on us. The assumption was that they want to learn how to crop dust, and I'm sure that's what they told the people that they made inquiries of.
Atta and his gang did not actually hire a crop dusting plane, and the New York Times has reported that it would not be an effective way of delivering an anthrax attack. But one other sinister incident suggests that Atta continued experimenting with chemical weapons.
He said, I have red itching hands. What can I do for this? It was quite obvious that he knew what had made his hands red.
In the months, weeks, and days leading up to September 11th, Mohamed Atta trekked back and forth across the country, perfecting his preparations for America's worst ever terrorist attack. He met with the other hijackers to go over their plan again and again. He used ATMs to withdraw tens of thousands of dollars to pay for flying lessons, plane tickets, and a series of cheap apartments. He rented computers in libraries and copy shops so he could send emails to his bosses back in the Middle East without ever leaving a trace. Nothing he did raised a red flag of warning.
There was never any sense that this was a man who was posing a risk to this country, and he never was watched for that reason.
2 weeks before September 11th, Atta and another hijacker entered Huber's Pharmacy in Delray Beach, Florida. The two men's suspicious behavior drew the attention of pharmacist Greg Chatterton. He approached Atta, who told him he needed something for his hands.
They were red from the wrist down. They weren't blistered, they were simply red. I then asked him if he had perhaps gotten into a garden where he was maybe working and got a fungus, and he laughed at me, he scoffed at me, and that's why one of the reasons I remember him. He says, "I don't garden."
Greg asked Atta repeatedly what he had been doing to make his hands so red and sore, but couldn't get a straight answer.
It was quite obvious that he knew what had made his hands red. He was becoming very arrogant, and he wanted just to get to the product, buy it, and leave.
Atta grabbed a tube of cream used for treating burns, paid, and abruptly left the store.
Why did Mohamed Atta have reddened, chapped hands? We worry that maybe he was engaged in some kind of biological weapon preparation. We wonder why he lost it so quickly, and wonder whether he was under some increasing personal pressure as his mission approached, or whether he was simply getting angrier and angrier at the society that he was hoping to destroy.
The New York Times believes Atta ultimately abandoned his experiments with chemical weapons, but he continued meticulously planning for the day when he would kill and be killed.
It is an impressive achievement to be able to want to die, to go through all of the training that he did, to learn what he did, and still, at the right moment, on cue, lead 19 men to their death. We haven't seen something like that before.
In the weeks leading up to September 11th, Atta made repeated journeys traveling thousands of miles to ensure that every detail of his plan had been covered.
We believe that he did take a number of practice flights between Boston and Los Angeles so as to observe these flights.
There is evidence to suggest that Atta may have visited New York before the 11th, perhaps to check out his target. The FBI now says that Atta's credit card was used on September 8th by a group of Arab men meeting in a bar at this hotel in Midtown Manhattan. But Atta was back in Florida on September 9th. He spent his last night there in a bar. As a devout Muslim, he was not seen drinking alcohol. Instead, he played a video game obsessively for 2.5 hours. On September 10th, Atta began his final journey. He flew with one of the other hijackers from Miami to Boston. From there, that same day, they rented a car and drove to Portland, Maine. A few of Atta's final movements were recorded by security cameras on September 10th.
We know that he drove from Boston to Maine, and because of security cameras in a store in Maine, also a cash machine in Portland, Maine, we have pictures of him. We know where he was.
Atta and an accomplice checked in here at the Comfort Inn at 5:43 p.m. At around 8 p.m., two men answering their description were seen having a quick dinner at a local pizza restaurant. At 8:31 p.m., Atta's car was photographed pulling up to a Key Bank ATM. The men drove to a second ATM where they were caught on camera again at 8:41 p.m.
In none of these occasions does he seem to be perspiring, out of control.
At 9:30 p.m., the two Arabs were seen shopping at this Walmart. The FBI have not revealed if they bought anything in the store. By 10:20, they had returned to the Comfort Inn, where they went straight to their rooms for what was to be their last night on Earth. Investigators later found what appears to be last-minute instructions used by the hijackers to prepare themselves for their final mission. The author is thought to be Mohamed Atta.
The time for play is over, and the serious time is upon us. Be happy, because you are heading for a deed that God loves.
Clearly, it talks about preparing yourself physically and emotionally and spiritually for that final act that brings you into paradise.
At 5:35 the next morning, Atta and his accomplice hurriedly checked out of the Comfort Inn and drove to the airport. At 5:45 a.m. on September 11th, Atta was photographed one last time going through security.
I wouldn't say that he looks lighthearted, but he definitely seems to be focused and clear-minded and not somebody who's about to blow up the world.
There are very powerful feelings they're feeling, obviously, that are nothing like fear. They're the opposite of fear. They're loving, their moment of glory, their final vindication. Whether a voice of fear intervenes at some point, whether there's that murmur of love and fear and a wish to live, only God knows.
At 6 a.m., Atta took off for Boston. Less than 3 hours later, he had taken over the controls of American Airlines Flight 11 and was flying towards the World Trade Center. The events of September 11th stunned the world and terrified America. Again and again, America has asked, who could have done this? Who could hate us so much?
When we think of someone who would kill thousands of people, we think of a madman. By definition, for us, such a person is a madman. But Mohamed Atta does not fit that profile at all. It forces us to re-examine our prejudices and our notions about the kind of person who could carry out such an act.
Although no one can now get inside the mind of Mohamed Atta, it seems clear that he was so driven by a hatred of all things American that he was prepared to kill and be killed.
Obviously, it's not normal for individuals to kill themselves. They do that because hatred and faith, they've merged in their souls, and they want to, express that hatred in the most effective way possible. And melting the skyscrapers of the World Trade Center in New York, I think, just about the ideal way of expressing that hatred, and at the same time expressing their devotion to the one true faith.
This lethal combination of hatred and devotion can be read plainly in the note of instruction found in Atta's suitcase.
If God decrees that any of you are to slaughter, you should dedicate the slaughter to your fathers.
It is plain that Atta was not the only one. 8 years earlier, in 1993, another devout Muslim turned Islamic terrorist, Ramzi Youssef, had also tried to destroy the World Trade Center. Youssef was brought to justice by former FBI investigator William Gavin, who says the first bomber shared Atta's implacable hostility towards America.
With the Ramzi Youssefs and the Mohamed Attas, there is no respect for anything other than what their goal is. And if people die, and the more people that die, and the more horrific the crime, the worse the better it becomes for them. And they don't realize that really polarizes the resolve of the American people. This is not going to go away.
The search for physical evidence at Ground Zero has been matched by psychological investigations in an attempt to understand the mind and motivations of terrorists like Mohamed Atta.
What we're dealing with is groups of people who have nothing to look for except destruction. The whole purpose of their movement is to destroy us, to destroy themselves, and in the process of destroying everything, somehow something new will come from it. There is no concrete goal, there is no concrete plan, it is just destruction. So we have to be frightened of it.
One of the most frightening things about Mohamed Atta is just how normal his upbringing was.
Atta not only does not fit the standard profile of the young, desperate suicide hijacker, there is something else which is quite exceptional about this operation and about Atta. Mohamed Atta had an enormous amount of time for second thoughts. This is a man who knew he was headed toward his own death.
In this sinister videotape discovered late last year, Atta's controller, Osama bin Laden, pays special tribute to the leader of the September 11th attack. Mohamed Atta is the only one of the hijackers to be singled out for praise. While Mohamed Atta is demonized in the West, he has become a hero and an inspiration to the next generation of Islamic terrorists.
Well, I don't think we know how many Attas there are. I think that if Osama bin Laden had them in reserve, we probably would have seen some more of them by now. But that doesn't mean that we won't see them in the future.
Osama bin Laden showed his delight at the carnage and high death toll caused by Atta and the other hijackers.
It doesn't take very many men to, in fact, shake a country the size of the United States. And that it really, you can have rather small units. In fact, you're better by having rather small units. They are in fact more lethal. They're harder to find, they're harder to stop.
September 11th may have seemed our worst nightmare come true, but there's little reason to think that America's war on terror since then has removed all future threats. So long as religious fanaticism is combined with hatred, a willingness to kill, and a desire to die, the likelihood of more Attas emerging in the future remains all too clear.
We must not sit back and say, well, Mohamed Atta is dead, so I guess we're done with this now. That's not the case. We believe that 50 to 70,000 people have trained in al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan. Anyone who has spent any time in the Muslim world is aware of the deep sense of humiliation and resentment that still is throbbing just below the surface and often above the surface. And there's every reason in the world to worry that the forces that produced September 11th are still at large and must be dealt with.
Since September 11th, a powerful message has been sent to the world that America will not stand by in the face of terror. But even if one terrorist network is eradicated, the threat of further attacks remains. In the handwritten note, later found by the FBI, Mohamed Atta instructed his fellow hijackers on how they should behave on their last day. He wrote, "Let each find his blade for the prey to be slaughtered. When the plane starts moving, then you are traveling toward Allah, and what a blessing that travel is." Atta's successors still wait in the wings, ready and willing to kill and be killed, and to follow their hero into martyrdom.